I often think about that night as the moment when my life cracked open like a glass dropped onto marble. Everything looked flawless until the very second it shattered. The story began on a Thursday evening in early autumn. I had just finished another long day at the office in London. My company was entering its busiest quarter, deals piled on my desk, calls from clients buzzing my phone. I was exhausted, but satisfied in that peculiar way only hard work can bring. Success, after all, was the one thing in my life that truly belonged to me. That was when my mother called. Her voice on the line had a sweetness that felt unnatural. "Adelaide," she said, "you must come home this Sunday. We are having a family dinner. Everyone will be there. It has been far too long." I pressed the phone against my ear and stared at the rain outside my office window. The Thames glimmered in the distance, streetlights flickering along the embankment. I could almost predict where this was going. For years, their calls only came with a hidden agenda, a loan disguised as a favor, a request wrapped in guilt. And yet, there was always that foolish part of me that longed for acceptance, that hoped maybe this time it would be different. So I said yes. The drive back to my childhood home was long. London's dense traffic thinned into rolling countryside roads. By the time I turned into the Matthews estate, dusk had settled like a heavy cloak over the land. The house loomed in front of me, an old stone manor dressed in ivy, its tall windows glowing with warm light. It should have felt comforting, but instead it tightened around me like a trap. Inside, the scent of roasted meat and rosemary filled the air. Candles flickered across the long dining table. Silverware gleamed. Everything looked staged, as if they were actors preparing for a play, and I had walked in as the final audience. Clara was the first to greet me, her wine glass raised lazily. She looked perfect, as always, in a silk dress that probably cost more than her monthly rent, though I knew she had never paid a bill on her own. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that dared me to question her. Nathan followed with a smirk. He leaned against the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had no responsibilities, no burdens, and no shame. I remembered how many times he had switched university majors, how many business ideas he had pitched before abandoning them within weeks. Each failure had been covered not by his effort, but by money that mysteriously left my account. My father was already seated at the head of the table. His tie was perfectly straight, his hair combed with precision, but his eyes avoided mine. My mother moved with rehearsed grace, pulling out a chair for me as though nothing had ever been wrong between us. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine that perhaps this time there truly was no hidden agenda. Perhaps it was simply a family dinner. Perhaps we would talk about old memories, laugh about trivial things, and pretend that the wounds of the past were not still bleeding. We sat down. Plates were filled, glasses clinked, words floated across the table. But beneath it all, I felt the tension simmering. My instincts whispered that something was coming. It happened after the main course, when the roast beef had been sliced and the candles had burned low enough to cast long shadows across the table. Nathan cleared his throat dramatically, like a man about to deliver good news. He leaned forward, elbows on the polished wood, and grinned as if this were a game he had already won. To avoid misunderstandings later, he began smoothly, "Mom and Dad want you to know about the will. Everything, the estate, the villa in Italy, the investments will go to Clara and me." The words cut into the silence like a knife. My fork froze midway to my lips. For a second I thought I had misheard him, but when I looked at my mother, she nodded calmly. "Yes, Adelaide," she said, her tone as soft as silk but her eyes sharp as blades. "Your father and I decided this is what is best. You already have your company, your apartment in London, your independence. Clara and Nathan still need stability." My father lowered his gaze into his glass of wine, refusing to meet my eyes. That silence told me everything. I felt something inside me break. The years of sacrifice, covering the estate's mortgage when they were drowning in debt, paying the utilities, investing tens of thousands into restoring the Italian villa because my mother insisted it must remain a family legacy, all of it collapsed into a hollow laugh that escaped my lips. "A foundation?" I repeated bitterly. "Nathan is 32 and still jobless. Clara is nearly 30 and has never kept a career for more than 6 months. And you say they need stability?" Clara's lips curved into a smirk. "Do not be petty, Adelaide. You are wealthy. Do you really need to keep receipts of every penny you spent?" Her words ignited a fire in my chest. Wealthy. That was the excuse. To them, my success was not an achievement but a punishment, a reason to exclude me from what should have been mine by blood and sacrifice. My mother slammed her hand against the table so hard that the silverware rattled. "Enough. Stop obsessing over money. We made this decision out of love. Love. The word tasted like poison. If this was love, then why did it only flow one way? Why was I the one always giving, always rescuing, always sacrificing? Nathan leaned back, crossing his arms with mock sympathy. You are behaving like a spoiled child whose toy has been taken away. Grow up, Adelaide. I stared at him, and in that moment the truth crystallized. I was not a daughter, not a sister. I was an account balance, a source of endless funds. They had never loved me, only what I could provide. My chest rose with slow, deliberate breaths as I stood. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. My hands trembled, not with weakness but with the weight of resolve. I am done, I said. My mother blinked. Done? What do you mean? I met her gaze with a calmness that felt sharper than any scream. I am done funding you, done rescuing you, done pretending this is a family. Nathan chuckled, though unease flickered in his eyes. You are going to cut us off just like that? Yes, I said, and one day you will understand what that means. I turned toward the door, but my mother's voice rang out, sharp and frantic. If you leave this house tonight, Adelaide, do not think you can ever come back. My hand touched the cold brass of the doorknob. I looked back once at the faces of the people who had consumed me for years and whispered, I never truly belonged here anyway. The door closed behind me with a sound that echoed through my bones. Outside, the night air was crisp and wet. The rain had stopped, but the road glistened under the pale light of the moon. I walked to my car with a heaviness pressing down on me, yet underneath it pulsed something unfamiliar, freedom. The estate shrank behind me as I drove away, swallowed by the dark countryside. Each mile put more distance between me and the illusion I had called family. By the time the city lights of London appeared on the horizon, I realized this was not the end of something. It was the beginning. The drive back to London felt endless. My thoughts tangled like threads pulled too tightly. The image of their faces replayed over and over in my mind. My mother's cold resolve, my father's cowardly silence, Nathan's smugness, Clara's mocking smile. Each one pressed into me like a bruise that would never heal. The motorway stretched ahead, wet and glittering under the streetlights. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my knuckles pale, my breaths uneven. Every mile carried me further from them, yet the weight of their betrayal sat in my chest like lead. I had always known my place in the family was conditional. They called when bills needed to be paid, when debts stacked too high, when Clara wanted a new wardrobe or Nathan needed tuition for another degree he would never finish. But still, foolishly, I had believed there was love beneath it. I told myself that love is what families are made of, that sacrifice would eventually be seen, if not praised, at least respected. Tonight proved otherwise. By the time I reached my apartment, my shoulders ached from tension. I tossed my keys onto the counter and sank into the sofa without even removing my coat. The silence pressed heavy around me. For once, there was no phone ringing, no requests, no demands, just silence. I poured a glass of wine, the red liquid catching the city lights outside my window. With trembling hands, I opened my banking app. My stomach turned at the numbers staring back at me. £2,100 every month, that was what I had been sending home. $1,500 for the estate's mortgage, $600 for utilities and maintenance. And that was not counting Nathan's tuition fees, Clara's endless shopping, the renovations on the villa, the holidays where I ended up covering every expense. I scrolled through the history, a timeline of sacrifices that no one ever acknowledged. 10 years of steady withdrawal from my life into theirs. 10 years of being their safety net while they walked freely without consequence. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. How blind I had been. I tapped the button to cancel every recurring payment. A small message appeared on the screen, successfully canceled. For a moment, I simply stared at those words. Relief washed through me in waves, strange and foreign. It was as though invisible chains had been cut from around my chest. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But relief did not last long. I knew my family would not accept this quietly. They thrived on my compliance. Without it, they would not recognize me at all. The first call came the next morning. My mother's number flashed across the screen. I ignored it, then another, then another. By the fifth call, I silenced my phone completely. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee as the voicemail notifications piled up. Out of morbid curiosity, I played them. Her voice filled the room, sharp with false indignation. Adelaide, what have you done? Do you have any idea how much the estate needs that money? Stop being selfish. Family must support each other. Call me back immediately. Selfish. That word struck me like a slap. A while later, my father tried. His tone was quieter, almost pleading. Adelaide, please reconsider. Your mother is upset. We cannot let a small misunderstanding tear us apart. We are family, family, the word rang hollow. By afternoon, Clara called. I did not answer, but her texts arrived within seconds. Pathetic, Adelaide. You are nothing but petty and jealous. Do you really think you are better than us just because you have a company? You are destroying this family. Congratulations, I laughed bitterly. Destroying the family? No, I thought I was only refusing to let them destroy me. Then Nathan called. Against my better judgment, I picked up. His voice exploded through the line. What the hell do you think you are doing? Taking back what is mine, I answered calmly. You are disgusting, Adelaide. You cut off support for Mom and Dad just because you were not included in the will. You are nothing but a greedy leech. A leech. The irony nearly made me choke. This is not about money, Nathan. It is about respect. Something I have never received from any of you. His voice darkened. You think you can abandon this family without consequences? Just wait. He hung up before I could reply. A chill ran down my spine. I had expected anger, insults, guilt. But there was something in his tone, a promise of retaliation, that unsettled me. I looked down at my phone, the names on the screen glowing in the dim light. Mom, Dad, Clara, Nathan. The people who should have been my refuge were my predators instead. Not one of them had said the words I longed to hear. Not one of them had said, I am sorry. Instead, all they offered were accusations and threats. My fingers hovered over the screen. One by one, I pressed block. Their names disappeared silently, like ghosts fading from sight. The silence that followed was heavy but peaceful. For the first time in a decade, I felt free of them. That night, as I sipped my wine by the window, the city lights glittered below. I felt the faintest curve of a smile tug at my lips. I was free, or so I thought, because deep inside, I knew the storm was not over. No one like them would let go so easily. And when they came back, as I was certain they would, I would be ready. The days after I cut them off were eerily quiet. Too quiet, almost unnatural. I had blocked their numbers, yet silence itself seemed to carry their voices. I could still hear my mother's scolding echo in my head, my father's feeble attempts at reasoning, Clara's bitter texts, Nathan's warning tone. I had shut the door, but their shadows lingered in every corner of my apartment. At work, I buried myself in meetings and projects. My company was growing, my team thriving, clients praising my vision. Outwardly, I appeared composed, driven, untouchable. But in the stillness of my evenings, the weight of betrayal pressed heavy on my chest. I would pour myself a glass of wine, sit by the balcony overlooking the Thames, and replay that dinner again and again. Every sneer, every dismissive glance, every cruel word. I wanted to believe I was done. I wanted to believe I had walked away forever, but something inside me refused to rest. A voice whispered, "They will come for you again, they always do." And I was right. 3 weeks after that night, an email slipped into my inbox. It was from my mother, short, cold, Adelaide. The family is having a meeting this Friday, 7 o'clock. The house. This is not optional. I stared at the words, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The phrasing was not an invitation, not a request. It was a command. I could have ignored it. I could have deleted it and never looked back. Yet a foolish part of me still wondered, still hoped for something different. Perhaps I told myself they would finally face what they had done. Perhaps they would realize the damage and try to make amends. So I replied with one word, fine. The drive back to the estate was heavier this time. My chest felt like a stone, my mind buzzing with questions. Would they apologize? Would they try to bargain? Or would it be yet another ambush? When I pulled into the driveway, I already had my answer. Nathan's BMW gleamed arrogantly under the porch light. Clara's pink Mini Cooper was parked beside it, almost mocking in its brightness. The house loomed larger than before, oppressive, suffocating. The front door opened before I even knocked. My mother stood there smiling, but the smile was too wide, too polished. It was not warmth, it was performance. Adelaide, she said smoothly, you finally decided to come home. I stepped inside. The air was thick, almost damp with tension. My father sat in the living room, his face grave but expressionless. Nathan and Clara lounged on the sofa, their eyes glinting like predators waiting for prey. Something was very wrong. I sat across from them, crossing my legs, folding my arms, my expression as cold as the chill in my stomach. So I said flatly, what is this about? My father cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. We need to resolve the tension. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Tension? You mean the fact that I stopped paying for all of you? My mother sighed, her tone soft but edged with steel. Adelaide, you overreacted. Your father and I only wanted what was best for everyone. Nathan scoffed. Did you even think before cutting us off like that? Do you have any idea how childish and selfish you look? My jaw tightened. Childish? Selfish? I had been the one keeping the family afloat for over a decade. If anyone here was selfish, it was them. Clara leaned forward, her voice deceptively gentle. You are just acting like a victim. Let's be honest. You are angry because Mom and Dad did not leave you an inheritance, aren't you? A sharp fury stabbed through me, so deep it almost made me laugh. Angry about inheritance? They had rewritten history, turning my pain into a petty tantrum. I slowly stood, my gaze cutting across each of their faces. I came here tonight because some naive part of me believed you might finally understand what you have done. That maybe there was room for honesty. I laughed, sharp and bitter. But no, you are still the same. Leeches. Selfish. Ungrateful. My mother rose to her feet, her voice like a blade. If you walk out that door tonight, do not expect to be welcomed back. I reached the doorway, my hand resting on the knob, and turned just enough to meet her eyes. I never felt welcome here in the first place. Then I left, my footsteps ringing against the marble floor like the beat of war drums. The night swallowed me as I drove back to London. My heart pounded with rage and something else, a foreboding I could not shake. I had thought the storm was passing, but I was wrong. This was only the beginning, because when I reached my apartment, I froze. The door was sealed shut. A thick grayish-white foam covered the entire frame, hardened like cement, expanding foam. Someone had deliberately sabotaged my home. My pulse thundered in my ears. I did not need to ask who. With shaking hands, I opened my security camera app and rewound the footage. And there he was, Nathan, wearing a gray hoodie and a baseball cap, grinning smugly as he sprayed the foam into every crevice of my door. Each motion, each careless laugh burned into me like fire. He thought this was funny. He thought he could intimidate me. He thought I would crawl back to them, begging for forgiveness. But he was wrong. I stared at the screen in disbelief, my breath caught in my throat. For years, Nathan had been reckless, spoiled, entitled, but this was different. This was malice. He wanted me to feel unsafe in my own home. He wanted me to break. Instead, something inside me hardened. Calmly, I saved the video and took screenshots of his smirking face. Then I called the police. 30 minutes later, a young officer stood outside my apartment, his expression a careful mask of sympathy and professionalism. He examined the door, touched the hardened foam, and nodded. Do you want to file a formal complaint? He asked, his tone neutral but almost hesitant, as though he hoped I would say no. I let out a cold laugh. I did not call you here for a chat. Yes, file the report. He opened his notebook, pen scratching across the page. The name of the suspect, I met his eyes. Nathan Matthews, my brother. Then, after a beat, I added, not anymore. The words tasted sharp but liberating. By the following morning, the calls started again. My father's number flashed on my phone. Against my better judgment, I answered. Adelaide, sweetheart, he began with a trembling voice. Does this really have to go so far? Are you calling to ask me to drop the charges? It is not that, he said quickly. Nathan was just upset. He did not mean any harm. No harm, he sealed my front door shut, I snapped. What if I had an emergency? What if I had a child or even a pet inside? What then? There was silence on the line. He thought he could intimidate me. I will show him he chose the wrong person. Adelaide, please, my father begged, you are tearing this family apart. No, I said coldly. This family tore itself apart a long time ago. 3 days later, the money appeared in my account. £33,000. A transfer from my parents' joint account. Not a word of apology. Not a message of regret. Just money thrown like a bandage over a wound they had carved themselves. I stood by my newly repaired door, tracing my fingers over the smooth surface. The money was not the victory. The real victory was this. For the first time, they had been forced to face consequences. They could hate me, curse me, call me selfish, but they could no longer control me. I thought that might be the end of it, that perhaps now they would finally leave me in peace, but I had underestimated their hunger. When they realized they could not break me directly, they turned to another weapon: reputation. It began slowly, with distant relatives I had not spoken to in years sending messages that dripped with judgment. Adelaide, I am so disappointed in you. Your parents sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay them. Do not let money ruin your humanity, another scolded. Family is forever. I cannot believe you abandoned them, a cousin wrote. They are on the brink of losing their home. Do you feel no guilt? I laughed aloud reading them, though my stomach twisted with disgust. I knew exactly where these lies came from. My mother had found a new angle, spinning a story where she and my father were poor, abandoned victims, and I was the cold-hearted daughter who cut them off. She could not win with truth, so she twisted it. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Let them talk, I thought. The truth is mine to live with. But then I remembered the hollow look in my mother's eyes that night at the estate, the way she had slammed her hand on the table and accused me of greed. I realized silence was no longer an option. I opened my laptop, logged into my rarely used Facebook account, and began to type. My hands shook, not from fear but from release. For 10 years, I wrote, I paid hundreds of thousands of pounds for my parents. I covered their mortgage, their bills, my siblings, tuition, their vacations, their luxuries. I never complained because I believed family meant support. But when my parents finalized their will, they left everything to my siblings. Their reason? That I did not need it. When I protested, they called me selfish. When I stopped financing them, they called me a traitor. Now they tell others I abandoned them. Here is the truth: they are not losing their home. They are losing the free support I provided. And that is not betrayal. That is setting boundaries. I pressed post. Within an hour, hundreds of comments flooded in. Some offered sympathy, others judgment. Strangers shared their own stories of exploitation, of toxic families that drained them dry. Others scolded me for airing dirty laundry in public. I read each one with calm detachment. I had not posted for sympathy. I had posted for freedom. To reclaim my voice, to show the world I was no longer afraid of their lies. 3 hours later, my mother called. Adelaide, what on earth are you doing? You are destroying this family's reputation. No, I answered quietly. You did that the moment you turned me into the villain. She spat my name like a curse. You will regret this. I ended the call with a small, steady smile. No, I thought. For the first time, you are the ones who will. That night, as I stood on my balcony with the wind curling around me, I realized something profound. I had been raised to believe blood was everything. That family bonds were unbreakable, sacred, worth any sacrifice. But in truth, family was not defined by blood. It was defined by respect, by love freely given, not demanded. And finally, after years of being consumed, I was free to define it for myself. I thought the storm had finally broken after I posted the truth online. My family had gone silent, at least outwardly. No more calls, no more relatives shaming me on behalf of my parents. My account was quiet, my phone still. For a few days, I allowed myself the fragile illusion that perhaps it was over. But peace never lasts when you are dealing with people who thrive on chaos. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning as I left my apartment for work. I noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. The handwriting was scrawled angry, traitor. That was all it said. One word, pressed so hard into the paper that it nearly tore. I looked around the street. Commuters bustled past, a delivery van idled at the curb. No one paid me any attention, but my skin prickled as though unseen eyes were watching. I crumpled the note and tossed it, but the unease lingered all day. By Friday, it escalated. I returned from the office to find a dead bouquet of roses left at my door. The petals were shriveled, the stems brittle, tied together with a ribbon that looked disturbingly familiar. It was from the estate. I remembered that pattern of lace from my mother's sewing room. I stood in the hallway, staring at the bouquet, my pulse hammering in my ears. It was not Clara's style, not Nathan's either. This felt different. It felt deliberate. The neighbors peeked curiously as I carried the wilted flowers inside and dropped them in the trash. My hands shook, not from fear, but from rage. I refused to let them win. That night, I opened my laptop and contacted my lawyer, a woman named Caroline who had helped me draft contracts for my company. I told her everything, from the inheritance ambush to Nathan's sabotage with the foam, the police report, and now the threats. She listened silently, then said firmly, Adelaide, you need to protect yourself legally. Do not let them drag you back into their control. She helped me draft a restraining order against Nathan. It was not immediate, not guaranteed, but it was a step. A statement that I would not tolerate further intimidation. The next morning, I woke to a string of messages from unknown numbers. Different accounts, different area codes, but all with the same venom. Ungrateful witch. You abandoned your parents. No inheritance for you, greedy whore. I hope you rot. I read them one by one, each like a stone hurled at my chest. Then I noticed something. Some of the phrases were eerily similar to things my mother had said in the past. Too precise, too familiar. My mother, I realized, was feeding them lines. She was orchestrating this, whispering poison into other people's ears and letting them do the dirty work. The thought chilled me. All this time, I had assumed Nathan and Clara were the primary enemies, while my father remained passive and my mother merely cruel. But now I saw the truth forming like a shadow at the edge of light. She was the mastermind. The foreshadow was clear, though I did not yet have proof. That Sunday, I decided enough was enough. I spent hours compiling everything, screenshots of threatening messages, photographs of the wilted roses, the police report of the foam incident, even bank transfers showing how much I had given them over the years. It was a dossier of a decade's worth of exploitation and abuse. I did not publish it this time. Not yet. I sent it directly to a journalist friend, someone I trusted, with instructions: hold this. If anything happens to me, release it. It felt dramatic, even paranoid. But the relief I felt afterward told me it was the right choice. The following week, Clara appeared at my office. I nearly laughed when the receptionist buzzed me. She was standing in the lobby in an oversized coat and sunglasses, as though she were some celebrity avoiding the paparazzi. Against my better judgment, I told them to send her up. She swept into the room, perfume clouding the air, lips curved in that infuriating smirk. So, she said, "This is where you hide now, surrounded by your little empire." I leaned back in my chair, arms folded. "What do you want, Clara?" She tilted her head, eyes glinting. "You think you are clever, exposing us like that. But you should know, Mom is furious. She will never forgive you." Her words were meant to scare me, but instead, they confirmed my suspicion. This is Mom's war, I realized. Nathan is just her hammer, Clara her mocking echo. My father, a shadow who follows wherever she leads. I smiled coldly. Then she will have to live with the truth. Clara's smirk faltered for a split second before she recovered. "Do not pretend you are innocent, Adelaide. You are the selfish one." I stood slowly, my presence towering over her. For the first time, I watched her flinch. "No, Clara, I am the free one." She spun on her heel and left, the door slamming behind her. I stood by the window for a long time after that, staring at the Thames glittering under the afternoon sun. I knew then that this was not just a family dispute. It was a war of control, a war I had already chosen to fight, and I was not going to lose. The days after Clara's little visit felt strangely calm, but I knew better than to trust the silence. Silence was never peace in my family, it was preparation. I could almost hear my mother's mind working, her calculating thoughts turning behind that flawless exterior. It happened on a Thursday evening. I had stayed late at the office, reviewing quarterly reports, when I noticed my phone buzzing with an unfamiliar number. Normally, I ignored such calls, but something urged me to answer. The voice on the other end was trembling. "Adelaide, this is Mrs. Doyle, your parents' neighbor. I thought you should know there were people outside your parents' house last night. I saw Nathan and a man I didn't recognize. They were burning papers in the garden. Important papers, I think. It looks suspicious." I thanked her politely, but inside my stomach knotted. Burning papers. My mind raced immediately to the will, to financial documents, to anything that could tie back to me. That night, unable to sleep, I opened my laptop and combed through my files. I had years of receipts, bank transfers, proof of the money I had funneled into the estate. But something felt incomplete, as though there was a piece of the puzzle I had missed. Then I remembered the night of the foam sabotage. In the footage, Nathan had been grinning, yes, but his body language had been odd. At one point he paused, turned his head as though listening. Then, just for a fraction of a second, another figure appeared at the edge of the frame. It was blurry, almost a shadow. But the height, the posture, I knew it instantly. My mother. My breath caught. She had been there. She had watched him do it. For days, I had convinced myself it was all Nathan, reckless and stupid, desperate for revenge. But no. He had not acted alone. He never did. He was my mother's weapon, carrying out her anger while she remained invisible. The foreshadowed twist had become undeniable. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. A sick realization spread through me. My mother had orchestrated everything: the inheritance ambush, the guilt-tripping, the smear campaign, even the sabotage of my home. Nathan and Clara were simply pawns, my father the silent enabler. The true enemy was her. I closed the laptop slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. The truth was heavier than rage. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stepped onto my balcony. London sprawled below me, lights shimmering like stars scattered across the earth. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother clearly, not as the woman who raised me, but as the architect of my pain. And knowing that truth gave me a strange sense of calm. I was not crazy. I was not selfish. I was fighting a war against someone who had been waging it long before I realized. The next day, Caroline, my lawyer, called with news. The restraining order against Nathan was in progress, but she warned me not to let my guard down. People like him rarely stopped when told. I almost told her about the shadow on the footage, about my mother's unmistakable figure. But I held back. Something told me to keep it close, to let the knowledge grow quietly until I was ready to strike. Instead, I asked Caroline to look into the estate's financials, the wills, the property records. If there was any weakness in their fortress, I wanted it uncovered. By evening, I received another sign. A package left at my door without a return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was me, taken from across the street, clearly without my knowledge. I was walking to work, coffee in hand, my expression weary. On the back, written in neat, feminine script, were 3 words: "You cannot hide." The handwriting was hers, my mother. I felt the air leave my lungs. It was confirmation of everything I feared, and yet in some twisted way it also liberated me. The mask was gone. She was not even pretending anymore. I set the photo on the counter, poured myself another drink, and stared at it until the edges blurred. You cannot hide, maybe not, but I could fight. I picked up my phone, opened a new document, and began to write. Not another Facebook post, not this time. This was for me, a record. A chronicle of every manipulation, every theft, every cruel word. If they wanted war, I would give them history as my weapon. The night stretched long, and the city outside eventually went to sleep. But I stayed awake, typing, remembering, recording. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. This was no longer a story about inheritance or money. This was a story about freedom, about finally breaking free from the woman who had built me in order to consume me. When dawn broke, I looked at the photograph again. My mother's words no longer felt like a threat. They felt like a challenge, and I intended to win. The photograph sat on my kitchen counter for days, its glossy surface catching the light whenever I walked past. Sometimes I would pause and look at it, the grainy image of myself crossing the street with a coffee in hand. I wondered who had been holding the camera, whose eyes had tracked me from a distance. But I already knew whose handwriting marked the back. You cannot hide. It was no longer subtle, no longer disguised as love or concern. My mother was declaring war in her own elegant, calculated way, and she did not stop there. Within a week, the whispers began to spread louder than before. This time it was not just cousins and distant relatives sending judgmental messages. It was people from my childhood, former neighbors, even acquaintances I barely remembered. The story was everywhere. Adelaide Matthews, the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her poor aging parents. I first noticed it at work. A colleague pulled me aside after a meeting, his voice low. "Adelaide, I heard something unpleasant. People are saying you cut off your parents, that they're about to lose their home. Is that true?" The question was asked gently, but it still pierced me. My chest tightened. I forced a calm smile and answered simply, "People say many things," but inside, anger boiled. My mother was clever. She knew she could not force me back through guilt alone, so she had turned to the only thing she still had power over, my reputation. The next blow came on social media. One morning, I opened my phone to find myself tagged in a post by a woman I vaguely remembered, an old family friend, someone who had always worshipped my mother's polished image. The post read, "It breaks my heart to see how Adelaide treats her parents. After all the sacrifices they made, this is how she repays them. Some people value money over blood." The comments beneath it multiplied like weeds. Some strangers defended me, others condemned me, many simply fed on the drama. I wanted to throw the phone across the room. Instead, I set it down carefully, poured myself black coffee, and stared out the window. If she thought reputation would break me, she underestimated me. That evening, I sat at my desk with my laptop and began to write again. This time not just a long post, but a carefully crafted statement. I listed the facts in black and white: the mortgage payments, the utilities, the tuition, the luxury trips. I attached screenshots of bank transfers, redacted only enough to protect my accounts. I laid it bare, the decade of financial servitude I had endured. I hesitated before pressing post. My hand hovered, heart pounding. To expose them so openly felt like tearing the last thread that tied me to them. But then I remembered that night at the estate, my mother's voice cold as ice. "If you leave, don't come back." So I pressed the button. The reaction was immediate. The post exploded across platforms, shared and commented on hundreds, then thousands of times. Some praised my courage. Others condemned me for washing family linen in public. But the truth was out. No longer a whisper, no longer twisted by their narrative. My voice was louder than theirs now. Hours later, my phone rang again. I recognized the number before it even finished buzzing. "Adelaide," my mother's voice hissed when I answered. "What do you think you are doing?" "Telling the truth," I replied calmly. "You are destroying this family's reputation." "No," I said softly. "You destroyed it the moment you lied." There was silence, broken only by her sharp breath. Then she spat, "You will regret this." I hung up without another word. For the first time in years, I felt light. But freedom came with its own shadows. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. My post had gone viral, and though many supported me, many others had turned venomous. Hate messages poured into my inbox. Some told me I was heartless, others called me greedy, still others hoped for my downfall. It was strange, the way strangers could hate so passionately based only on fragments of a story. But what mattered to me was that my truth had been spoken. The next morning, as I walked to work, I noticed a man across the street holding up his phone. The lens glinted in the sunlight. He lowered it quickly when I looked his way, disappearing into the crowd. Paparazzi, or someone sent by them, I could not tell, but my life was no longer private. My mother had turned it into spectacle. Still, I lifted my chin and kept walking. If she wanted a war of reputation, then she would see how strong I could be when stripped of everything but truth. The weeks that followed were a blur of firestorms. My story had ignited something far bigger than I anticipated. Messages flooded my inbox, not only from strangers who judged me, but from people who quietly confessed their own battles. "I have lived this too," one woman wrote. "My brother drained my parents for years while I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. When I refused to give more, they cut me out of their lives." Another message came from a man in New York. "Thank you for saying what I never could." Sometimes family are the ones who hurt us the most. Reading these words, I realized that my story was no longer just mine. It had become a mirror for others, a torch passed between survivors of quiet exploitation. That gave me strength, but the other side was relentless. One afternoon, as I stepped into a cafe near my office, I overheard 2 women whispering at a corner table. Their words drifted toward me. "That's her, the Matthews girl. Imagine leaving your parents like that." I froze with my coffee halfway to my lips. They did not lower their voices when they saw me glance their way. Instead, one raised her brows with pity, the other with disdain. I wanted to tell them everything, that the estate they mourned had been rebuilt with my money, that the parents they pitied had treated me as nothing more than a wallet. But I swallowed the words. Explaining to strangers who fed on gossip was pointless. Instead, I walked out with my head held high. That night, I called Caroline again. She listened patiently as I vented about the smear campaign. When I finished, she said something that changed the way I saw it. "Adelaide, you are winning. Do you understand that? They are furious because they cannot control you anymore. Reputation is the only weapon they have left." Her words settled into me like steel. She was right. If my mother had to spin lies to keep me under her thumb, it meant the chains were already broken. Still, I could not ignore the danger. The photograph of me on the street still sat on my desk, a reminder that this was not just words but surveillance, intimidation. I doubled down on precautions. I hired private security for my apartment building, added extra locks, even changed my daily routes to the office. Each decision felt paranoid, but each one calmed the fear gnawing at me. Then came the confrontation I knew would happen eventually. It was late evening when I returned home from work. As I unlocked my door, I felt a presence behind me. My body tensed. "Adelaide." The voice was soft, but it cut like a knife. I turned slowly. My father stood in the dim hallway, his shoulders slumped, his face worn. He looked smaller than I remembered, as though the years of silence had finally folded him in on himself. We stood there for a long moment, neither of us speaking. Finally, I said flatly, "What are you doing here?" "I came alone," he said quickly, raising his hands as if to prove it. "Your mother doesn't know I'm here." I let out a sharp laugh. "Do you expect me to believe that?" He winced but pressed on. "Adelaide, please, she is out of control. Nathan and Clara follow her lead like sheep. But I can't keep doing this." I searched his face, looking for sincerity, but all I saw was weakness. A man who had always chosen silence over justice. So why now? I asked coldly, "Why come to me now after everything?" "Because I am afraid," he whispered. "She will not stop, not until she has destroyed you completely." His words chilled me, not because they were new, but because they confirmed what I already knew. My mother was not finished. She would never be finished. I stepped closer, my eyes locked on his. "Then stop her." He looked away. "You know I can't." "Then we are done here," I said, turning the key in my lock. "Adelaide," he reached out, his hand trembling, but I pulled back. "No, you had decades to choose me. You never did." I closed the door in his face. Inside, I leaned against the wood, my heart racing. His visit had not been comfort. It was a warning. I poured myself another drink and walked to the balcony. The city spread beneath me, alive with light. For years, I had mistaken survival for love, obligation for loyalty. Now I knew better. If my mother wanted to wage war in the court of public opinion, I would let her. But I would not cower. I was no longer the dutiful daughter begging for scraps of affection. I was Adelaide Matthews, and I was free. The night air wrapped around me like armor. I took a long sip of whiskey and whispered to the skyline. "You cannot hide," she had written. No, I thought. but neither can you. The months that followed my father's midnight visit felt like waking up from a long, restless sleep. For so long, I had lived in reaction, responding to their demands, their betrayals, their endless hunger for more. Now, for the first time, I asked myself what I wanted, what I truly wanted, beyond the noise of family, beyond the weight of obligation. The answer did not come all at once. It revealed itself in small, almost ordinary moments. One Saturday morning, I found myself wandering into a photography shop tucked away on a quiet London street. The walls were lined with cameras, both gleaming digital models and old film bodies that seemed to hum with history. I had always loved taking pictures, capturing fleeting moments of light and shadow, but it had been years since I allowed myself that luxury. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with kind eyes, placed a vintage Leica in my hands. I felt the weight of it, cool and solid, like something permanent in a world that had felt so fragile. "You have an eye for this," he said after I snapped a few shots of the dusty window. I left the shop with the camera slung across my shoulder, and for the first time in years, my heart felt light. From then on, photography became my quiet rebellion. Every spare moment, I carried that Leica with me, through crowded markets, along the Thames, across misty parks at dawn. I captured strangers laughing, children chasing pigeons, lovers holding hands beneath street lamps. Each frame felt like proof that life was still beautiful, still worth noticing. And with every photograph, I rebuilt myself. Meanwhile, whispers of my family's decline trickled back to me through acquaintances and the inevitable gossip of small social circles. Nathan had been fired from his banking job after missing too many days and making too many reckless choices. Clara, once the darling of charity galas, was now a regular feature in tabloids, photographed stumbling drunk from clubs. My mother, I heard, was furious. She fought harder than ever to maintain her perfect image, attending luncheons and giving polished speeches. But behind closed doors, cracks were spreading. Without my money, the estate was bleeding. Bills piled, staff were let go, repairs postponed. I tried not to revel in it, but there was a dark satisfaction in knowing they were finally facing the consequences of their own choices. Yet freedom was not just about watching them fall. It was about rising myself. So I booked a trip. It had been years since I allowed myself to travel for pleasure. My family had always mocked the idea, why spend money on fleeting experiences when there were more practical needs? But this time, there was no one to stop me. I chose Italy. Florence in the spring. The city of art, of light, of history so rich it seeped into the cobblestones. The moment I stepped out of the taxi and into the narrow streets, the scent of espresso and fresh bread swirling through the air, I knew I had made the right choice. I wandered through galleries, marveling at paintings that had survived centuries of war and change. I stood beneath Michelangelo's David, overwhelmed by its quiet defiance. I ate gelato by the Arno, my camera always clicking, capturing moments of joy I thought I had forgotten how to feel. And then there were the sunsets. From Piazzale Michelangelo, the whole city stretched before me, rooftops glowing gold as the sun sank behind the hills. I lifted my camera, but then lowered it again. Some beauty was meant to be lived, not captured. That night, as I sat on a terrace with a glass of Chianti, I realized something. I did not need my family's approval. I did not need their inheritance. I did not even need their forgiveness. What I needed was this, moments that belonged only to me. For the first time, I felt alive. When I returned from Italy, people told me I looked different. Lighter, freer, as though the years of strain had finally slipped from my shoulders. They weren't wrong. Something had shifted in me during those weeks abroad. For the first time, my reflection no longer felt like a stranger. Back in London, I carried that lightness with me. My work thrived, my company expanding into markets I had only dreamed of before. My colleagues began to notice my confidence not as something brittle, built on armor, but as something radiant, effortless. I laughed more freely in meetings. I stayed late not because I had to, but because I wanted to. My business was no longer a shield against loneliness, it was becoming a playground for my ideas. But it wasn't just work. I spent long weekends exploring the countryside, sometimes alone, sometimes with new friends I had allowed into my life after years of isolation. We hiked in the Lake District, kayaked along winding rivers, even camped under stars that seemed brighter than I had ever remembered. And always, my camera was with me. Photography had grown from a quiet hobby into a passion that colored the way I saw the world. I began to submit my work to small exhibitions. To my surprise, one of my pieces, a black and white shot of an elderly couple holding hands on a rain-slick street, was accepted into a gallery show. On the opening night, as strangers stood before my photograph and whispered admiration, I felt a surge of pride unlike any I had felt from financial success. Money could be counted, but this was immeasurable. Meanwhile, word of my family's decline became impossible to ignore. The estate, once a symbol of permanence and wealth, had become a crumbling facade. A friend of mine who lived nearby told me the roof leaked, the gardens overgrown, the staff reduced to a skeleton crew. Neighbors whispered about unpaid bills and late-night arguments that carried across the lawn. Nathan's downfall came next. One morning, his name blazed across the business pages, disgraced banker involved in embezzlement scandal. He had been caught moving client money into personal accounts, desperate to cover his growing debts. He lost his job, his license, and soon after, his fiancée. Clara, on the other hand, spiraled into scandal of a different kind. Her name appeared in tabloids weekly, photographed staggering from parties, her face smeared with tears or makeup. She had once been the darling of charity balls, now she was a punchline. And my mother, my mother. Still, she held her head high in public, pearls gleaming at her throat, smiles perfectly practiced. But her empire of image was collapsing. Invitations dwindled, friends drifted away, creditors circled. Through it all, I did not gloat. I did not post about their downfall or fan the flames of gossip. I simply lived. That was victory enough. One rainy afternoon, I found myself at the Tate Modern, camera in hand, staring at a massive installation of shattered mirrors. My reflection broke into 100 pieces, fragments scattered across the glass. For a long time, I just stood there, breathing slowly. That was who I had been, splintered, distorted by the weight of their control. But now, piece by piece, I was rebuilding. Not into the daughter they wanted, not into the provider they expected, but into myself. As I left the museum, I thought of something my father had whispered during his visit. She won't stop until she's destroyed you. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps my mother was still plotting. But that was her prison, not mine. I had tasted freedom, and no smear campaign, no threat, no inheritance withheld could take it away from me. That night I sat on my balcony, the Thames rolling dark and endless below, and whispered into the wind, I am not afraid of you anymore. The city lights flickered like stars, and for once I believed it. It began, as so many unexpected chapters do, with a chance encounter. I had signed up for a weekend retreat in the Scottish Highlands, something I would never have dared in the past. The itinerary promised hiking, bonfires, and nights spent beneath stars brighter than anything London could offer. It sounded reckless and deliciously free. On the first morning, as we gathered at the base of a craggy hill, I noticed him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and an ease in his stance that made him seem part of the wild landscape itself. He wore no airs, no polished mask, only a quiet confidence. His name was Ethan Collins. We were paired together on the hike, and though I was wary of small talk, his presence was disarming. He asked questions, but not the kind that probed or pried. Instead, he seemed genuinely curious, about the way I framed photographs, about why I had chosen this retreat, about what I hoped to see at the summit. When I stumbled on a loose rock, he caught my arm, steady and sure. I almost pulled away out of habit, but something in his touch was different. There was no control in it, no demand, only steadiness. By the time we reached the top, the view stretched endless before us, rolling green, distant locks shimmering like silver. I lifted my camera, but Ethan shook his head. Sometimes you just need to see it with your eyes, he said softly. I lowered the lens and for once simply looked. That night we sat by the bonfire, flames painting his face in gold. He spoke about his work, landscape restoration, rewilding projects across the country. His voice carried a kind of grounded passion, rooted in soil and stone rather than ambition or wealth. I listened, drawn in despite myself. Something about him felt dangerous, not in the way of threats or harm, but in the way of opening doors I had locked shut for years. Over the next days, we walked side by side, sharing stories in fragments. I told him about photography, about my love for capturing unnoticed beauty. I did not tell him about my family, not yet. That world felt toxic, a shadow I was not ready to invite into this new light. But Ethan saw something in me anyway. You carry yourself like someone always ready for battle, he said once as we rested beside a stream. But you don't have to fight everything. The words lodged in my chest. He could not know the weight of them, and yet, somehow, he did. When the retreat ended, I expected that to be the end. A fleeting weekend, another chapter in my rebirth, but Ethan asked if I would like to join him on another hike the following month. And against every instinct honed by years of distrust, I said yes. Back in London, I felt the absence of my old defenses. For the first time in years, my evenings weren't filled with wine and the bitter replay of family arguments. They were filled with anticipation. When we met again, our rhythm was already there, unforced. He teased me for stopping every 10 minutes to photograph a wildflower or a strange shadow on the rocks. I teased him for carrying snacks as though we were climbing Everest instead of a gentle hill. It was easy, effortless, and it terrified me. Because if something felt this safe, it could be stolen. One night, weeks later, we sat together in his small flat overlooking the sea. He poured me tea, not wine, and asked about my family. The question hit like a stone dropped into still water. I stared into the cup, steam curling upward, and for a moment considered lying. But then, slowly, I told him. Not everything, not the darkest parts, but enough. About the inheritance, about the sabotage, about how I had cut them off. He listened quietly, no interruption, no judgment. When I finished, he simply said, "You survived them. That's all that matters." It was the first time anyone had said it that way. Not "you abandoned them," not "you should forgive," just "you survived." In that moment, I knew I was falling. I also knew the past would not stay buried forever. Because a week later, while I was at Ethan's, an envelope slid through my apartment door back in London. When I returned and opened it, my world shifted on its axis. Inside was a photocopy of a legal document, the will, but not the one my parents had shown me at the dinner table. This one listed me, Adelaide Matthews, heir equal to Nathan and Clara. I read it once, then twice, then again, my pulse racing, my stomach hollowing. The date was recent, the signatures clear. It was official, which meant the dinner, the announcement, the humiliation had been a lie. The betrayal was not in the ink of a legal document. It was in the performance of that night. A staged cruelty designed to cut me down, to sever me willingly from them. I staggered to a chair, the document trembling in my hands. All this time, I had believed I was disinherited, that my parents had chosen Nathan and Clara over me. That pain had driven every decision since, but it was never real. It had been orchestrated, manipulated. And for the first time, I saw the shape of the truth. My mother had wanted me out. She wanted me to walk away, so she had crafted a scene cruel enough to ensure I did. The ground beneath me tilted. My rebirth, my freedom, even my rage, it had all been built on a lie. And the worst part? I almost admired the brilliance of it. The will lay on the table in front of me, its pages still trembling from where I had dropped them. My apartment felt smaller, the air heavier, as though the walls themselves leaned closer to watch my reaction. I pressed my hands against my face, then dragged them down slowly. A bitter laugh escaped me. Of course she would twist even this. It was not about inheritance. It had never been about the money. It was about control. My mother had orchestrated the dinner like theater, rehearsed lines spoken with conviction, each sibling cast in their role. Nathan, the sneering executioner. Clara, the mocking echo. My father, the silent audience. And me, the condemned, the outcast, the one meant to walk away. And I had played my part perfectly. For months, I had lived with the belief that I was erased from their legacy. I had built my rage and my freedom on that foundation. And now I had to face that I had been deceived. I wanted to throw the document into the fire. But instead, I called Caroline. When she picked up, I could barely form the words. I sent her photos of the will, my voice shaking. She studied them carefully before speaking. "This is genuine, Adelaide, recent, binding, so they lied to me." "Yes," she said softly, "they staged it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, I whispered, "Why?" Caroline exhaled, and I could almost hear the weight in her voice. "Because if you believed you had nothing to gain, you would walk away. And they thought they could control what you did from a distance." My chest tightened. It was worse than betrayal. It was manipulation at the level of identity. They had not only stolen from me, they had stolen my narrative, my very sense of self. That night, I sat with Ethan in his small flat by the sea. The waves crashed against the cliffs outside, relentless, eternal. He listened as I unraveled everything, the will spread out on the table between us. When I finished, he reached across and took my hand. "You have every right to burn it," he said, "or you have every right to use it. But either way, Adelaide, do not let it define you again." I stared at him, my throat tight. "You don't understand. That night, that dinner, it broke me. I built everything since then because I thought I was unwanted." He squeezed my hand gently. "And maybe that lie gave you the push to finally live for yourself. If that's the case, then they failed. Because you're here, you're stronger. And you're not theirs anymore." His words sank into me like rain into parched soil. For so long, I had carried the story of abandonment like a wound carved into my skin. Now I realized I had been scarred not by absence but by deception. The next morning, I made a choice. I dressed carefully, black trousers, a fitted coat, nothing dramatic but sharp enough to cut. I tucked the will into a folder and drove back to the estate for the first time in months. The house looked smaller than I remembered, though it was the same stone walls, the same wide lawns. Weeds had begun to creep along the driveway, and the once manicured garden sagged with neglect. When my mother opened the door, her smile was sharp enough to wound. "Adelaide," she purred as though nothing had ever happened. I brushed past her without a word and entered the living room. Nathan and Clara sat on the sofa, their faces pale, guilty shadows of their former arrogance. My father lingered in the corner, eyes downcast. I placed the folder on the coffee table and slid it open. The will gleamed up at them like a mirror reflecting their lies. No one spoke, not even my mother. Finally, I said, "My name is right here, all along." Clara's mouth opened, then closed. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. My father's shoulders sagged, but my mother did not flinch. Instead, she smiled. "You always were too clever for your own good, Adelaide." Her calmness was more chilling than denial would have been. "You lied to me," I said, my voice low but steady. "You orchestrated everything." "Of course I did," she replied smoothly. "You needed to be cut loose. You needed to be humbled. Otherwise, you would never stop fighting me." The words stunned me. She had not even the decency to pretend otherwise. "You destroyed this family," I whispered. "No," she said sharply. "I held it together. You were the one who walked away." I laughed, bitter and broken. "You staged a play and expected me to live inside your script forever. But I am done." I gathered the will, closed the folder, and turned to leave. At the door, I paused, looking back one last time. "You tried to erase me," I said softly. "But all you did was set me free." My mother's smile faltered for the first time, just slightly, but enough. I walked out into the cold air, the sky heavy with gray clouds, and breathed deeply. The weight was still there, but it was no longer mine to carry. Back in Ethan's arms that night, I finally allowed myself to cry, not from weakness, but from release. Because the plot twist of my life had been revealed. I had never been disinherited. I had been deceived. And now that I knew the truth, I would never let them write my story again. A year can change everything. 12 months after that day at the estate, I stood once again on my balcony, camera hanging from my neck, staring out at the Thames glittering beneath the city lights. But the woman who looked at the water tonight was not the same woman who once stood here with wine in her hand, drowning in betrayal. I was different now, lighter, stronger, and my family, well, they had unraveled in ways even I could not have imagined. News of Nathan's downfall spread like wildfire. His trial made headlines across the financial pages. Embezzlement, fraud, reckless risk-taking. He was sentenced, not to years behind bars as some expected, but to community service and a ruined reputation that would never recover. His arrogance had curdled into bitterness, his smug grin replaced by hollow eyes in every courtroom photograph. Clara fared no better. Once the darling of society pages, she became their cautionary tale. Endless images of her drunk, disheveled, clinging to men who barely knew her name. Sponsors withdrew, charities cut ties, friends evaporated. Her beauty, which she had always treated as a weapon, became her prison, trapping her in a cycle of scandal she could not escape. And the estate itself, the grand Matthews home that had stood for generations, was collapsing. Word reached me that unpaid debts had forced the sale of furniture, artwork, even family heirlooms. The gardens were wild now, the roof sagging, the gates rusting. The house was a shell, a metaphor made real. My mother, of course, clung to her role as the perfect hostess to the very end. She still attended luncheons, still wore her pearls, still spoke with a smile that never touched her eyes. But people whispered now. They knew the facade had cracked, and she, more than anyone, was furious that she could not patch it back together. Sometimes I wondered if she thought of me when she looked at the ruins of the life she tried to control. If she regretted that night at the dinner table, the cruel performance that had set me free. But then I reminded myself, regret was not in her nature. Only pride, only control. And yet, I no longer needed her regret because I had found something greater. Ethan. We had grown together over the past year, not in some whirlwind romance, but in the steady, grounded way that roots grow beneath the soil. He had seen me at my most fragile, when the truth of the will shattered the foundation I thought I stood on. He had held me as I cried, had walked beside me when I doubted myself, had reminded me that survival was not shame. With him, I learned to trust again. Not blindly, not foolishly, but with intention. Trust as a choice, not a gamble. We built a quiet life together, divided between the city and the sea. My photography flourished, with exhibitions now inviting me instead of me begging them. I taught myself to savor moments rather than fear their loss. And sometimes, late at night, when Ethan's hand rested warm against mine, I marveled at the strange alchemy of life. That from betrayal could come freedom. That from deception could come clarity. That from loss could come love. Still, there were nights I dreamt of the estate. The dinner table where it all began. Of my mother's smile as she pronounced my exile. I woke with sweat on my skin and rage simmering in my chest. But then I would rise, walk to my balcony, breathe in the cool London air, and remind myself that was her story, not mine. I had written my own. One afternoon, nearly a year to the day since I last saw them, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting before I even opened it. Inside was a single photograph. The estate now abandoned, windows boarded, paint peeling. On the back, 3 words in her elegant script, "This is yours." I stared at it for a long time. She had lost, and in her own twisted way, she was trying to hand me back the ruins. I placed the photograph in a drawer and closed it. I did not need the house. I did not need the legacy. What I needed, I already had: freedom, love, and the ability to choose my own life. That night, Ethan and I drove to the coast. We sat on the cliffs as the sun sank into the horizon, my camera clicking softly beside me. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders and I leaned into him, breathing in the salt air. For the first time, I felt the story was truly over, but not in tragedy. In rebirth. The sea was calm that evening, its surface painted in hues of copper and violet as the sun slid lower and lower into the horizon. Ethan's hand was steady in mine, warm against the cool air, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I was not waiting for the next storm. For so long, my existence had been a cycle of reaction, reacting to my family's demands, their betrayals, their manipulation. But now, as the waves sighed against the cliffs, I was simply present. I was living, not surviving. In the weeks that followed, I continued to receive fragments of news about the Matthews name. Nathan had left the city, fleeing the humiliation of scandal. Clara had entered a rehabilitation center after her latest public collapse, and my mother, always proud, always performing, was said to be living alone in the crumbling shell of the estate, her circle of admirers reduced to a handful of sycophants too afraid to abandon her completely. People asked me if I would go back, if I would reclaim what was technically mine by law, the house, the name, the legacy. Each time I answered the same way. No, the Matthews estate was never my home. It was a prison built from polished stone and sharpened expectations. To take it back would be to chain myself again. I had no desire to inherit ruins. One morning, I visited the gallery where my latest photographs hung. There was a small crowd gathered in front of one of my pieces. A shot of a lone woman standing on a windswept cliff, her hair wild, her back to the camera as the sea stretched infinite before her. The plaque beneath it read, "Freedom." A woman in the crowd turned to me without recognizing who I was and said softly, "It's so powerful. You can feel the weight she left behind." I smiled and whispered, "Yes, you really can." In that moment, I understood something vital. Art had given me what my family never could: a voice, a mirror, a legacy of my own making. Later that day, I walked with Ethan along the Thames. The city buzzed with life around us, boats cutting across the water, tourists leaning over bridges, the hum of music spilling from cafes. He asked me, half joking, if I would ever consider writing my story down. I thought about it. Not as revenge, not as an exposé, but as truth. Because if there was one thing I had learned, it was that silence only served those who thrived on control. Perhaps one day, I told him. But for now, I am still living it. He smiled, pulling me close, and I felt the steadiness of his presence anchor me in the chaos of the world. That night, as I lay in bed, I allowed myself to remember the girl I had been, the dutiful daughter pouring money into a house that was never a home, the woman silenced at a dinner table by the cruelty of a mother who needed control more than love. I thought of the endless nights I had drowned in wine and despair, believing I had been erased. And then I thought of the woman I was now, Adelaide Matthews. Photographer, businesswoman, survivor, beloved, free. The twist of my life was that I had never been excluded, I had been deceived. But perhaps in a strange, bitter way, that lie was a gift, because it forced me to walk away, to build something that was mine and mine alone. I no longer wished for reconciliation. I no longer waited for apologies. I no longer sought the inheritance of crumbling walls and poisoned memories. My inheritance was freedom. My legacy was love. As the city lights blinked through my window, I whispered the words I wished I had said long ago. I am not yours anymore. I am my own. And with that, I closed my eyes, not to dream of the past, but to rest in the peace of the life I had finally chosen.